Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Serious. People who went missing. What happened? Episode 2. When I was 17, I was suddenly and forcibly escorted from my room in the middle of the night and tucked away in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, Utah. My parents had a vague idea of where I was and a lot of incorrect ideas about what was going on there, but no one else I knew, family, friends, etc., knew about it. I just disappeared off the face of the earth for 9 months. This is the most up-to-date news to come out of the latest incarnation of that school. It would be shut down, then reopened in a new place periodically. Outside of the abuse, I learned some life lessons. The first of which is to never do that to my future child. But I got some crazy stories from that place, and sadly being confined and cut off from the outside world was actually more freedom than I got at home. But yes, came home and right away messaged my best friend for a tearful reunion, as he assumed I was gone forever. 4 out of 10 overall, definitely made me who I am now, but that place had some messed up stuff. I went to one of these programs as well. I think the part that got me was we were allowed to write a letter home once a week, but it was monitored to ensure that we weren't saying anything negative about the program. Whenever I received letters, there were sharper redactions from whatever the therapist thought that I didn't need to know. I also had to author a 1,000-word essay on why I was walking through the center with no shoes on, and a second on why I went to a different room without asking when I ran to a bathroom to vomit from food poisoning. A young girl I knew had been in programs for 5+ years because her adoptive parents didn't want her around and the state would pay for residential treatment. Every time she graduated from one, a van for another would show up and take her away. When I was 17 and a few years after my release, my mom and I got into a fight, and she immediately started driving towards the highway to take me back. When she told me what she was doing, I immediately decided that jumping out of the car on the highway was better than going back. I was in the hospital for about a week while she still thought that treatment was the best decision she ever made. I moved out as soon as I was released from the hospital. I was living with my new husband in a town about 1,000 miles away from my mother, who has always been a world-class warrior. This was in the days before everyone had a cell phone. His entire family was going to be invading us in a few days, so I was polishing up the apartment to look good, and in the process of wiping fingerprints off the phone, I turned the ringer off and did not notice. We'd just moved in, so several days without any calls weren't unusual. Fast forward. The in-laws have just arrived while I am lying down in the bedroom taking a nap because I've been spitting shining everything in the place and making tasty baked goods all while coming down with a bad cold. There's a knock on the front door. My husband comes to the bedroom and says there's someone who wants to talk to me. It's the police, and they insist on talking to me alone in the hallway to make sure everything is really, truly okay. Then they tell me to call my mother. I came back in to see his parents, sister, brother-in-law, their 7 kids, and a passel of assorted aunts, uncles, and cousins, all staring silently at me. But wait, there's more. Mom didn't have our address. All she had was a description of the building. The town was small enough that the police knew just where that was, but they didn't know what apartment was, so they knocked on every other door in the building before getting to us on the top floor corner unit. When I was 16, I got into a fight with my mother about how to properly load dishes into a dishwasher. Actually, she yelled a lot, and I failed to react. They were dishes, who cares? At that point in my life, she was running her own business, and my father was working full-time. So all of the chores in the house were being done by me personally anyway, and at that point I had been loading the dishwasher incorrectly for the better part of 6 years, and felt it didn't matter if she thought it was wrong now. Well, I decided that telling her that was the way to end the argument. As you could probably predict, it did not. She threw me out of the house. In typical teenage fashion, I told her if she threw me out, then I wouldn't come back. At that point, she had escalated to white-hot rage and said something like, "We don't want you here anyway." Well, that was all I needed, and really she should have been paying better attention to me. See, I had gotten a job as soon as I had turned 14, and I had purchased my own car. I had been buying my own clothes and things for years with money from that job. I left and could honestly say that I hadn't taken anything from the house that I hadn't personally paid for. To that end, I left my cell phone on the table. They had no way to get in contact. So, hours later, when my mother's anger faded and she realized that she had just thrown her 16-year-old child into the streets over the dishes, she called the police. Well, the police showed up and heard her out. They put out the details on my car to try and find me, but they told her that since I had a car and clothes and had my own bank account, and I had been gone for hours, there was no guarantee that I was even in the state anymore. They really only started looking so soon as a favor to my mother. They weren't required to look at all, since it was clear that I was a runaway that had left under my own power. My father came home from work and was bewildered by all the chaos. I wish I could have seen his face. After 48 hours, they had declared I was missing, which apparently made my profile available to other states and such. And that was how they found me 2 weeks later, 18 hours away. I was sitting on the hood of my car, eating ice cream and filling out a job application. An officer noticed I was illegally parked and casually scanned my plates while he approached to ask me to move. I don't think he was going to give me a ticket. It was just a reflexive action. I came up as a missing kid, and he stopped mid-question and sort of stutters. You should call your mother. I nodded agreeably, and he gave me his cell phone. I dialed my mother's number from heart, and she picked up. As soon as I identify myself, she is turning into a screaming rage monster of hatred and insults. I casually put the phone on the speaker for the officer to hear, and his eyes widened. She didn't stop to take a breath and let me get a word in, so I hung up on her. I told the officer that I was fine where I was, and since it had already escalated to this point, I was going to hold out for an apology or divine intervention. He sorts of patted my shoulder and made sure I had someplace warm to sleep at night. 2 days later, my dad showed up and got me. The officer had called the department to say that the missing persons report originated from and gotten my father's contact details and told him that if the situation were left to my mother to resolve, they would never see me again. I agree that it was for the best. I could have gotten my GED and a job, but I certainly wouldn't have been able to make my way through college and get my master's. So, when I was about 15, I was living with my dad, who was going through a horrible divorce and custody battle with my mentally ill and abusive mother. Well, one day my mother came to the school car, picked up line ahead of my dad, stopped the car, got out, and tried to put me in the vehicle. I struggled and refused, but she's almost 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds opposed to my 5 feet and 90 pounds. A school administrator came over and asked what was going on. I said I didn't live with her, and my mother pulled the old, "I'm her mother, and she's just a stupid dramatic child making a scene" card. The administrator believes her and basically helped force me into the car. She also told the administrator, "Oh yeah, me and my husband are separated, and this is my day to pick her up. She's just being a brat because she wants to go to her friend's house." She got in the car and gave this smug, triumphant look, and I tried to open the door and get out, but she had the child lock on. My dad, who was further back in the car line, had no idea what happened, and he said he had just assumed I was goofing around in school with my friends and hadn't come outside yet. He went around the car line several times before he stopped and reported me missing. So, my mom told me she was driving me to the state capitol, where there was a youth mental hospital for runaways. You only needed one parent and a birth certificate to have someone committed, and there was no way my dad would know or be able to get me out for a while. I saw a police car start driving beside the car, and while my mom was distracted by monologuing G like the villain in a Disney movie, I just started screaming and beating on the window to get the police officer's attention. The police officer ended up pulling my mom over. My mother got out of the car to talk to the police officer away from me, and I just took the opportunity and ran out of her driver's side door, across a 4-lane highway, into some woods, and kept running. I don't know why I didn't go to the police officer. I guess I was afraid that since my mom was a police officer, she would talk her way out of it again. I ended up running through the patch of trees along the side of the road until I saw a gas station. There I called my dad using their payphone. He drove all the way out there to pick me up while I hid nearby in the trees, because I refused to trust anyone. She also pulled other crazy thing that year. She broke into my dad's while I was inside the house, violating the restraining order I had on her. I ended up climbing onto the roof and calling the police officers. She also gave a fake name and a fake license and went to my new school and claimed to be a massage therapist giving free massages to teachers. She found out who my teachers were and coerced information about me from them to try and snatch me again. I'm a grown-ass woman now, and I still deal with stalking, threats, and general insanity from a woman I haven't talked to in almost a decade on a regular basis. I was missing for 8 hours after my very first day of first grade and mobilized the entire police force of the rural town where I grew up. Before I was old enough for school, my single mom used to drop me off at a daycare place every day and pick me up every evening. This was in 1986, so way before cell phones or pagers were common. When I got old enough for first grade, my mom took me out of daycare because it was expensive and school would be my daycare now. My school was brand new. My first day would also be the first day the school was open. It was also the principal's first day as a principal and my teacher's first day as a full-time teacher. My mom did all the right things before she put me on the bus. She wrote my bus number in a permanent marker on the back of my hand, gave me specific instructions, and made me repeat them back to her, put all of her contact information in my pockets, etc. The first day at school was perfectly normal. I wrote ABCs, drew pictures with crayons, etc. Just like in daycare. My only specific memory was the cafeteria staff bring our lunches to us in the classroom, because the construction on the cafeteria wasn't complete yet. School gets out, and I head to the buses, staring dutifully at the bus number written on my hand. But the after-school pickup van from the daycare we used to attend was also there. The staffer from the daycare recognized me as I was walking by and called out, "Hey on, Shaun, we're over here. Come on, we're about to leave." I guess she didn't know or didn't remember that my mom had taken me out of daycare. Anyhow, this lady was a known adult authority figure, so I assumed plans had changed and I got on the bus. 3 stories happening at this point. Story 1. 6-year-old me had the best day at daycare ever. All my old friends were there. We talked about our first day at school. We played and played and played and seemed to last forever. Even after all my friends' mommies picked them up and I was the only one left, I had all the toys myself. I was so confused when my mom finally arrived, crying, bawling like I'd never seen her before. Story 2. My mom gets off work and waits at my bus stop. I don't get off the bus. She calls the school, and they mobilize the whole staff to look for me. Maybe I'm hiding in the bathroom? They don't find me. Hours have passed, and she's in full freak-out mode now. She calls the police. The police start searching the fields and farms near the school. Still no on Shaun. They bring in more officers and more officers until pretty much the entire police force of this tiny town is looking for me. Meanwhile, my principal and my teacher are having the worst day of their lives. How could they lose a 6-year-old person on their very first day? All the search turned out to be nothing, and it's past midnight now. So some poor officer had to tell my mom, "Ma'am, you should go home. We'll keep looking all night, but we won't be able to find much until the morning." My mom goes home thinking her baby is probably dead and arrives home to find her answering machine full. Story 3. It's 2 hours past closing time, and this kid's mom still hasn't picked him up. Didn't she cancel her service last week? Why is he even here? Call her again. Her answering machine is full. No, we better be getting overtime for this. So yes, I managed to upset the entire school system and traumatize my mom on my first day of school. I still refuse to accept responsibility. I was just doing what the grown-ups told me. I got blackout drunk on the 4th of July and presumably tried to walk home from my friend's house. The first thing I remember is being in a really unsure part of town, about 8 miles away from my home with my phone dead and still odd-faced. We went around knocking on people's doors at 3 in the morning trying to use a phone. I eventually stumbled to a grocery store at like 5 in the morning and asked for directions. When I walked outside, these 2 real gangsters looking at guys who were picking up more alcohol at the store asked if I wanted a ride. Being a very trusting person and drunk, I accepted. They lit up a blunt, and we smoked it as they gave me a ride home. I stumbled into my house at 6 to be screamed at by my girlfriend who thought I was dead because the last text she got from me was, "Help, I lost." I was about 10 or so, and I was a member of a club where I learned to shoot air rifles. My parents would drop me off, then go and take off again, and pick me up when it was time. One day, they didn't show up. I waited for an hour, called home. No answer. This was before cell phones, so I was stuck. No idea what to do. Well, I did have one idea. I knew how to get home. It would be about 6 kilometers walking, but I had a good mental map of the way back and the weather was fine. So I left the club and began to walk home. I made it about halfway before my parents pulled over next to me, and they were kind of angry with him. Also, kind of an apology because they'd forgotten about me. They told me not to wander off like that again, and I told them not to forget about me again. Didn't get any punishment. One time, when I was a kid, I went with my mom to the laundromat near our house. I had a batch of new comics with me, so after we loaded the washing machines, I sat down and started reading. After finishing my third or fourth comic, I set it down and went to see if the machines were done yet. They were, so I started unloading them into the rolling basket thing to move the clothes over to the dryers. My mom comes in and yells, "Where the hell have you been?" I'm baffled for a second. "I've been here, why?" "No, you haven't. After we loaded the washing machines, you disappeared, and I couldn't find you. I called the house, and you weren't home. Where did you go?" "I went over to that chair over there to read my comics." "No, you didn't. I was looking all over for you. I'd have seen you." Right then some kind chimed in, "Excuse me, miss, but I've been here for about a half hour, and your kid's been over there reading quietly the whole time." My mom huffed and fumed, and then went and called the house to tell them where I was. That's not the most missing I've ever been, but the other story is a bit more involved and convoluted, so unless people really want me to post, I'll just leave this amusing one. Last October, I was 14 and suicidal. This was a terrible, terrible time in my life, and I didn't know what to do. I live in Scotland, a tiny little village of around 600 to 700 people. I walked off to the nearby village where my school was. I walked up to the cemetery, which is on a hill next to the school. It was pretty dark at this point. I think it was about 6 p.m. It gets dark quickly in the winter. I went up to my grandfather's grave and lay down beside it, just talking since I hadn't visited in a while. He had died in 2012, and he's somewhat, albeit a tiny part of why I'm like this, so I let it all out. I had nowhere to go for that moment, so I just lay there. I stayed there until about 9 p.m., and I started to walk back. As I got close to home, the police picked me up and took me home. I'm tired, so sorry if none of this makes sense. If anybody replies at all, I'll get back to them when I get up. A few years ago, I was depressed and not really very social to begin with. At some point, my boyfriend at the time broke up with me, and I just snapped. I booked a train ticket for him, around 10h ride, and just left the next morning. Also, basically stopped going to work at the same time, from one day to the next. I told no one about the trip and stayed away for about 10 days. When I came back, I had a note from the police on my door about being registered as a missing person. I lived in a student house, so at least everyone on my floor must have seen that note. Turned out my friends had filed a missing person report because I guess work had contacted them. I was angry at the time because I felt weird and thought nobody cared about me anyway and shouldn't interfere with my life. Ironically, they had just shown that they did, indeed, care. Now I'm grateful that they did it. I was around 6 years old, and I was at a big camp out for Cub Scouts, like Boy Scouts for little kids. My dad said he was going to take the tent and stuff back to the car, and that I had to wait around the campsite for a few minutes. Well, in my little kid's brain, a few minutes felt like hours. I thought he had run away without me. So I grabbed my backpack and began walking away. I reached the parking lot and saw his car was still there. However, my little kid thought he had left anyway. I decided I would leave the camp and walk home. So I wandered around for a few minutes trying to find the exit. Then a man in a golf cart rode up to me. He asked me, "Are you Savage Cow?" And I just nodded my head because at this point I was crying. I took the cart with him, and he drove me over to where my dad was. Apparently, he really was only gone for a few minutes. He hugged me, and we went home. I used to escape a lot when I was really small, like 3 4 years old. Once, we spent the whole summer in this seaside town where my grandmother had a restaurant. It has a little marine, a big old town, and a huge hotel with a huge balcony in the open where a band plays every night for guests. So it has super busy every night in the center. My mom was holding my hand while we were walking, and somehow I disappeared. They looked for me everywhere for hours. In the end, my mom was certain I fell into the sea in the marine, and she was sitting there crying the whole evening. Around 2 a.m., a young Italian couple brought me to my grandmother's restaurant, kicking and screaming. Apparently, I was at the hotel mentioned the whole evening, dancing the night away. Everyone thought I was with someone. When all of them left, that couple saw me alone on the stage, playing with instruments. They recognized me from when they were having dinner at my grandma's place, so they knew where to take me. Needless to say, that my mom went crazy when she saw me crying for being taken away from the stage. I escaped a few more times. I had a Tinder account, but was too embarrassed to tell my friends. So, when I actually hit it off with this guy, and he asked me on a date, I didn't tell anyone. I was in college and in a sorority at the time that had weekly Sunday meetings. I never missed a meeting, and I lived with some of my sorority sisters, so we always walked to meetings together. Well, this day was on a Sunday, but I told the guy I had to be back for the meeting, easy get-out clause if the date went poorly. He was picking me up and taking me to dinner, but wouldn't say where. Super unsure, but I went with it. Turns out the date was great. So great that dinner lasted forever, and then we went out for ice cream. I totally lost track of time, missed my meeting, and of course didn't check my phone. I got back to my apartment hours after the meeting ended. It was full of my roommates and other sorority sisters freaking out about where I was. I was so giddy after the date, I totally wasn't expecting all the scared and angry looks. I told some lie about getting caught up at the library and forgetting my phone. It's been a year since that date, and I'm madly in love with him. Still, no one knows we met on Tinder. We plan to tell everyone about our wedding. I have 2 stories, actually 3. The first time I was about 6 or 7 years old. I was meant to get off the bus after school at my grandma's house. Me being the off with the fairies kind of kid, completely forgot and got off at my usual spot. After trying to figure out why no one was at my home, I came to realize my error. My grandma's house wasn't too far, a 10-minute walk, and I knew the way. When I got back, my brother was there, but Grandma had gone looking for me. She was upset with me when she got back. I think I got the wooden spoon there. Another time, when I was about 8 or 9, I was meant to walk home. We had moved since the last time, and meet my grandma, I put her through a lot. Well, I decided it would be so much more fun to hang out with my friend who had invited me back to her house. I told my brother the address, and he promptly forgot. It was 6 p.m., and I was completely wigging out because I couldn't get in contact with my grandma, and she hadn't come to get me yet. My friend's dad was going to take me home after he got back from work, but it wasn't until later. I was a bit of a crybaby. Finally got home, and my grandmother told me she'd been out looking for me and had even involved one of my teachers and was about to call the police. Avoided the wooden spoon on that one thanks flying stuff. The last time was a little shittier. I had just finished high school and went away with some friends. I had a tough time the last 2 years of high school. I had a bit of time battling with depression. Some of the girls I went away with, well, having a friendship with them is just poisonous. One of the last nights, it was like the final limit. 3 years of an awful friendship with these girls, plus having spent an entire week with them, just killed it. I went into panic mode, and I was distraught. I ran out the front door around the side of the house and hid myself under the balcony. I mean, I didn't really go anywhere, but they didn't know that. People got in cars and went looking for me, and other people scoured the house. It started raining. One of my good friends found me and carried me back inside. I do not converse with these awful people anymore. At least I try. My oldest daughter, Kay, went missing when she was 2. She's 11 now. It was about 9 a.m. I'm at work 2 hours drive away, and I got a panic call from her mother saying she can't find her anywhere and the front door is open. She had been sleeping and didn't hear Kay get up. I told her to quit messing around and call 911. I'm freaking out and leaving work immediately and start calling everyone I know local to home, relatives, friends, anyone who can start looking for her. 20 minutes later, a police officer pulls up front of our house with Kay in the front seat and her trike in the back. Long story short, Kay woke up that morning missing me and decided to come to find me. We went downstairs, managed to unlock the front door, went around the back of the house, and hopped on her trike. She then proceeded to travel about a mile on the sidewalk on her trike, in a diaper, before a Good Samaritan called 911 saying they saw a naked toddler by herself outside. She had a few cuts and scrapes but was otherwise okay. She was also mad that the police officer made her wear a seatbelt. I got lost for a few hours at a country show when I was incredibly young, 3 or 4 years old. I had been doing that where you follow what you think are your parents' legs, but it turns out it was someone else the whole time. Cause of the crowds, I got completely lost. Being so young, I just started wandering around on my own. My parents started freaking out. Mother was crying while my dad frantically got the organizers to start looking for me. Luckily, after an hour or so, I was noticed by a kindly group of older ladies who got hold of a steward to reunite me. This isn't remarkable in itself, but fast forward 20 years later, and by coincidence, I was at the show ground with my parents for another reason. I had completely forgotten about being lost, but it was obviously still ingrained in my parents' minds. As we drove around, there was no show on at the time. My dad points to a spot and goes out of nowhere, "That's exactly where you went missing." And then a few minutes later, and that's where they found you, and both started yattering on about what happened that day. Amazing to think after all these years that incident was fresh in their minds and they could remember it like it was yesterday. They were sort of joking around about it, but you could tell the emotions of almost losing me were still raw. They can't remember where they left the TV remote, but can remember the day they almost lost their kid as clearly as anything. I guess you never stop being a parent no matter how old your kids get. I grew up in the Australian bush in far north Queensland. We moved from our wilderness house in a town when I was 7 or 8, but we still had friends who lived in the bush, and we still went out there to spend our holidays doing stupid stuff with no adult supervision, shooting each other with potato pellets from an air rifle, chasing wild pigs with sticks, etc. I'm surprised we all survived. Anyway, one year my mother went to Sydney over our holidays and left our father in charge. At the same time, the wife of one of Dad's good friends from the bush also went away. They decided to go fishing and told us, myself, my brother, and the 3 youngest sons of the friend, that we should go on a hike or camping or something. Sounded like a great idea. So we hatched a plan to hike down the wild river from town to our friend's house in the bush. We packed well for a 2 to 3 day hike. We packed tin baked beans, dry noodles, and some cast iron frying pans. We didn't pack a can opener, matches, or water. The river is full of water, right? No problem. Our fathers were busy getting ready for their fishing trip, so they didn't really pay any attention to our preparations. They dropped us off by the river, and we set off. I'll summarize the trip as best I can. Within 2 hours, I almost drowned. I'm not a strong swimmer, and the river was a bit flooded. We found a rusty machete-type knife, which was fortunate because the only other knives we brought were butter knives and a $5 Swiss Army-style pocket knife. The riverbanks were overgrown with lantana. We lost some stuff to the river because the sand bank we made camp on partially eroded during the night. On the second day, the river made it to more arid land with steeper banks. We decided that following the river was too much effort, so we decided to make it overland and meet up with the river later. We never found the river again. After we left the river, our water intake was reduced to whatever stagnant pools we happened to stumble across. Our main form of navigation was the eldest brother, 14 or 15 at the time, of our friends, who we assumed had made the hike before. He hadn't. He just looked at it on a map once and thought it wouldn't be too hard. It turns out that his main method of navigation was the phrase, "All rivers lead to the dry river." Yes, the dry river was a very appropriately named riverbed that ran behind their property. We chased wild pigs with a machete, figuring that they would be good eating. Luckily, they just ran away instead of attacking back. We found some type of melon growing. Not knowing what it was, we decided possible poisoning was better than starvation, so we ate it. It tasted awful and somehow dry. Just as the sun was setting on the second day, we lucked out and started following a valley, which turned into a sandy riverbed. It turned out, by pure chance, to be the dry river, and after following it for about an hour, we recognized a landmark. After it was dark and gorged us on tinned fruit. I don't think I've ever slept so well in my life. We rang our fathers the next morning and told them what happened. Mom was furious when she found out.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.